You talk to yourself, out loud, not as a joke, not for attention. You do it when you're alone, when your mind is busy, when something is weighing on you and staying silent makes it worse. You rehearse conversations that haven't happened. You narrate your thoughts while pacing a room. You respond to imaginary dialogue as if someone else is there, listening. And the strange part is, you're fully aware you're doing it. Let's say this clearly. This is not a quirky habit, and it's not childish. You don't do this because you're lonely or unstable. You do it because silence doesn't work for you the way it works for other people. When pressure builds, your thoughts don't drift. They stack. They demand structure. Saying them out loud gives them edges. It turns mental noise into something you can actually hear, measure, and control. You've probably noticed it happens more during decisions, stress, or emotional tension. When something matters, when you're trying to make sense of competing thoughts before they swallow you. This isn't performance, it's processing. Here's the part most people misunderstand. You're not escaping reality when you talk to yourself. You're confronting it more directly than they do. Most people avoid hearing themselves think. They drown it out with distractions, people, noise, or constant input. You don't. You let the dialogue surface. You listen to it, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it exposes doubt, conflict, or contradiction. And that's the contrast that matters. They run from their inner voice. You give yours a microphone. The question isn't why you do this. The real question is what kind of mind refuses to stay quiet. You've noticed how quickly people label it. Talking to yourself gets filed under awkward, unstable, or socially off. You've felt that quiet hesitation when someone almost catches you mid-sentence. Not because you're ashamed, but because you already know they won't understand what's happening inside your head. Here's the thing, you're not louder than other people, you're clearer. Most people keep their thoughts vague, emotional, half-formed. They feel something and call it thinking. They let impressions blur together and mistake that blur for intuition. You don't work that way. When something matters, your mind wants structure. Sequence, testing. You pull thoughts out of the fog and place them in front of you where they can be examined. Let's say this clearly. This is not instability. It's self-monitoring. When you speak your thoughts, you're not losing control. You're organizing it. You're turning internal noise into something deliberate. What stays silent for others turns into emotional chaos. What becomes audible for you turns into order. That's the difference most people miss. This trait shows up in people who run scenarios before they happen, people who replay interactions to understand what was actually said, people who anticipate dynamics instead of stumbling into them blind. You don't wait for reality to explain itself. You simulate it first. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Society prefers people who feel confidently, not people who think precisely. That's why this gets misunderstood, not because it's wrong, but because it exposes how little reflection most people tolerate. Silence looks normal. Inner complexity looks suspicious. This isn't what loud people do. It's what internally complex people do. And the responsibility that comes with that is simple but heavy. If you can hear you're thinking this clearly, you can't pretend you don't know what you're doing anymore. You've felt it before the words come out. That internal pressure, the sense that your thoughts are moving faster than silence can hold. When you keep everything inside, ideas blur together. Decisions feel unstable. The longer you stay quiet, the messier it gets. So you speak, not because you want to hear yourself, but because your mind needs friction. Sound slows thinking down. It forces sequence. When thoughts are audible, they stop colliding and start lining up. You're not expressing emotion. You're managing cognitive load. Let's say this clearly. Talking to yourself is a control mechanism. When your mind is processing multiple possibilities at once, silence creates ambiguity. And ambiguity is expensive. It drains focus. It fuels overthinking. Speaking out loud builds boundaries. One thought ends before the next begins. That's why your thinking feels sharper when you hear it, not calmer, clearer. This isn't emotional overflow, it's mental regulation. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Some minds cannot afford vagueness. You notice patterns quickly, you simulate outcomes, you track social dynamics in real time. That creates volume. If you don't externalize that volume, it turns inward and loops. Talking breaks the loop. It anchors thought in space. It makes abstract ideas behave. This pattern isn't accidental, and it's not learned through damage. It develops because your mind demands resolution, not comfort. You don't tolerate half answers, you don't trust feelings without structure. So you force clarity by hearing your own reasoning. Most people can think loosely and move on. You can't. And that's the responsibility hidden inside this trait. When your mind refuses to stay vague, you don't get to pretend confusion is accidental. If you can hear your thinking this clearly, the real question becomes harder. What are you doing with that level of mental precision? You've probably noticed this too. The conversations you replay in your head are cleaner than the ones you actually have. Sharper, more controlled. You say the right things internally, at the right pace, with no interruptions. And over time, that starts to matter. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Rehearsal can quietly replace participation. When dialogue stays internal for too long, real conversations begin to feel inefficient, messy, unpredictable. You already know what you'd say, how they might respond, where it could go, so you delay. You wait for the right moment that rarely arrives, not because you're afraid, but because internal dialogue feels safer than external friction. Let's say this clearly. Thinking is not the same as engaging. People on the outside don't see your processing. They see pauses, distance, a kind of emotional delay. You may feel deeply present internally, but externally you can come across as distracted, unavailable, or slightly elsewhere. Not cold, just not fully there. There's an identity cost hiding underneath this. When your life is lived mostly in your head, action becomes optional. Decisions stay hypothetical. You become someone who understands situations better than most, but participates in them less than you could. That gap grows quietly. This is where most people lie to themselves. You tell yourself you're preparing when you're actually postponing. Inner narration becomes a buffer, a place to refine instead of risk, to analyze instead of act. And while that keeps things controlled, it also keeps them small. No fear here, just consequences. If everything meaningful happens internally, the outside world doesn't feel you. And over time, even you start to confuse mental movement with real movement. The silence after that realization isn't peaceful. It's heavy. You already know this part, even if you haven't wanted to name it. Talking to yourself has made you sharp, observant, hard to fool. But there are moments when that sharpness turns inward and stalls you, when thinking becomes a substitute for showing up. Let's say this clearly. Self-talk will never replace presence. It won't make people understand you better. It won't bridge distance. It won't protect you from discomfort or awkwardness or the risk of being misread. You can explain yourself perfectly in your head and still remain invisible to the people around you. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Clarity without exposure changes nothing. Your internal dialogue can refine ideas, test reactions, and anticipate outcomes. That's its strength, but it cannot create connection. It cannot build trust, and it cannot move your life forward on its own. Lived experience has a weight that thinking alone will never carry. This is where most people lie to themselves. They call it preparation because it sounds responsible. Internal dialogue feels productive without being risky. It gives the sensation of movement without requiring friction. You stay in control. No interruptions, no surprises, no consequences. And slowly, that control becomes the reason nothing changes. This isn't a moral failure. It's a trade. You trade immediacy for safety. You trade connection for precision. You trade presence for the comfort of being right in advance. And the longer that trade continues, the easier it is to mistake. Awareness for progress. Let's be blunt. Understanding yourself does not equal engaging with life. If your sharpness never leaves your head, it turns into a private advantage with a public cost. Awareness without engagement doesn't make you wise. It makes avoidance sound intelligent. The question that matters now isn't whether you see clearly. It's whether you're willing to be seen. You don't need to erase this part of yourself. You've never needed to. The mistake was thinking it had to run the entire room. Talking to yourself was never the problem. Letting it replace presence was. Here's the uncomfortable truth. This trait was meant to sharpen you, not shelter you. When it's integrated, your inner dialogue stops spinning and starts aiming. It becomes preparation, not refuge, precision, not noise. You still hear yourself think, but those thoughts have direction now. They end in movement, not loops. Let's say this clearly. You're not meant to be quieter. You're meant to be deliberate. The person you become isn't louder or more expressive. You become cleaner. Decisions land. Words are chosen and then spoken. You don't narrate life anymore. You participate in it. The thinking happens first and then it gets out of the way. This isn't about discipline or confidence or growth. It's about alignment. When thought and action finally touch, something changes in how you're perceived. Not because you're trying to be seen, but because you are present enough to be felt. Your clarity stops being private. It becomes visible. This is where responsibility returns. If you have a mind that can hear itself this clearly, you don't get to live vaguely. You don't get to hide behind endless refinement. Precision demands expression. Awareness demands embodiment. And here's the line most people never cross. This trait doesn't make you special by itself. It only becomes meaningful when it supports a life that's actually lived. One where thinking prepares you for reality instead of protecting you from it. So this isn't about stopping the dialogue. It's about deciding what kind of life that dialogue is in service of.